there folks, it's Kikoskia here and welcome back to Writing and Me. This video contains no gameplay or music whatsoever, allowing you to focus on whatever it is you're up to, whether it's playing games, writing, listening to music, or spinning around in a circle in an effort to spin so fast that you transport yourself to the time dimension, where time bends to your every thought, and you can make and unmake an infinite number of realities with just a glimmer of an idea that pops into your head. It may seem very tempting to go to the time dimension, but nobody ever comes back from it. Why? Because there are loads of people there all trying to create their own universes at the same time, and because they're all trying to do it simultaneously, they all enter into mind-time battles, where they all fight for control of the dimension. And to this day, nobody has actually managed to do it, because two people went in the first instance, and since then, loads of other people have arrived, and since time doesn't flow properly in the time dimension, they never age, which means they're stuck there forever. And because the time dimension doesn't have the same laws of physics that our universe does, that dimension is never going to end. So they're stuck there forever, in mental battles, trying to bend the dimension to their will, and if you think that sounds terrible, that's because it is. So think twice before you spin just that little bit faster, but if what I've said hasn't convinced you, by all means, give it a go. You may be the one with the will indomitable enough to gain control, but I don't rate your chances. That aside, we're going to talk about something that ends up popping up only after you've finished your first story. You've finally got to the end, you've gone through multiple different drafts, and it is finished. And you sit there, and you think for a little while about the story, and eventually something pops into your head. Why don't I write another one? Most people end up writing more than one story. I have tons of stories that I've written, some of which are incompleted, but many are completed. And some of them are in the same setting, and that's what I'm going to be talking about today, and that is the follow-on story. Now, what do I mean when I say follow-on? Most people will hear that and think immediately of a sequel, a story that takes place either directly after the previous story or some distance in the future, but it is still tied to the previous one. Sequel after sequel after sequel will eventually make a series, an overarching story that spans over multiple novels. But that's not the only thing that you could write. You could also write a prequel, which takes place before the story that you've just written, full of events leading up to what you've already written, or leading up to another story that will eventually lead up to what you've already written. You ultimately end up with the same flow as you would if you start with a story and make sequels, except the story that you've written first is the one that's actually last. Then you have concurrent stories, stories that aren't necessarily linked to the one you've just written, but do take place in the same universe. You may have the Galanian Empire trying to defeat the Wazglargs over on the right-hand side of the galaxy, but way over on the left-hand side of the galaxy you have a completely different organization, the Galdunian Federation, who've discovered a strange portal, and they travel through the portal to find that it is a mirror universe where everything is made of pineapples. And then they engage in battle with the Pineapple Foundation Force. That is a concurrent story. Then there is the what-if story, something that I have tried to write only once. You take the events from the story you've just written, and you look at one of them and go, but what if that was different? What if this event turned out differently? Some events have a bigger impact than others, but even the small ones have a ripple effect, the butterfly effect, that will end up changing so much more than you realise. Now all of this sounds very appealing. Writing a new story, diving into it head first and just going at full tilt to write more. But I urge caution. There are questions you need to ask before you undertake this endeavour. Some of these questions are very similar to the questions that you'd ask when you initially write your first story, but there are a few that are unique to writing a follow-up, and the first one is the most important. Do you have another story to tell? Some stories do not leave room for anything else. They don't leave room for a sequel, there isn't a concurrent story that you want to tell, and there isn't an idea in your head for a prequel. That doesn't mean that you can't find one, but you should err on the side of caution, because you need a solid idea that works with the story you already have. It needs to be as solid as the original story, and you need to go through the same process of creating this story as you did the first one. The worst thing you could do is force a story to be it a sequel or a prequel, that doesn't fit just so that you can stay in the same world when you write. Beware unneeded sequels. Beware unneeded prequels. Not every story needs a prequel to explain how you got to the point where you start in the original, and not every story requires a continuation. If you don't have an idea strong enough to carry the story forward, you'll end up writing something that you won't be happy with. Worse yet, you may end up making changes to the original story to try and make the sequel work, and end up making the original story worse in the process. Think long and hard about writing a follow-up of any kind. And if you don't come up with a good idea, don't rush in. Wait. Think. Plan. Being careful is always a good idea when it comes to something like this, and it's much better that you spend a lot longer coming up with an idea that you like than diving in head first without thinking and possibly making something that you don't like. If you spend all that time planning and end up not coming up with an idea and deciding that your story is fine as it is, that is an absolutely fine outcome. That is the best outcome for your story. Some people may look at that and think, no, there's got to be another story. There doesn't have to be another story. Sometimes you just write a story that is so neat in tying up loose ends and finishing everything that the end is absolute. The end is final. There are other things, of course, that will go on in that setting, unless, of course, you ended the story with ending the setting, but that is an entirely different problem that you'd have to solve if you're going to write a sequel, and discovering that is fine, because then you can focus on making a new setting, and a new story within it. If you do have an idea, however, there are some things that you should note when you are going about making this follow-on, be it a sequel, a prequel, or a concurrent story, or a what if. The first and most important thing is that you need to go into this knowing that a lot of the world building has already been done. This applies a lot more to sequels and concurrent stories. But it does have an impact with a prequel. For prequels, it depends on how far back you go. If you only go back a couple of weeks or a few months, most of the world building that you have made will apply. You should always consult it regardless of what story you're writing, and you should always keep it in mind. Because with you writing a follow-up, you need to be very careful not to inadvertently contradict things that you have already set in stone. If certain things work a certain way, you need to make sure that they continue to work that certain way, even if the characters don't understand how it functions. The same thing applies to locations. Things will certainly change as time moves forward, as they always do, and some things won't be there in the past, and other things will be there in their place, but there are always some things that remain, and you need to keep on top of that. I recommend a list of things that you're going to be consulting when you're writing this follow-on story, and making note of what will be the same and what will change. This is all part of planning and making sure that you start the story off on the right foot, and this is mostly the same planning that you would have been doing for the first story, except the focus is a little bit shifted because you've already got a lot of stuff, but you are going to need a lot more stuff for your follow-on. The next thing you need to note is that there's a high chance that there will be characters from the previous story in this one. The only time that it's very likely that that won't be the case is if you're writing a concurrent story, and it's a long way away from the story you've just written. But if you do have characters that you've written already, you don't have to go into huge detail describing those characters like you did the first time round, because the people who've read the previous book already know who they are. You do, of course, need to mention some things. You certainly need to go over changes, and it always pays to point out a few things about characters as the story goes on, but you don't need to have a huge amount of description. You don't need to go over what colour their hair is again, what colour their eyes are, and everything about them like you did the first time round. Little things dotted here and there are absolutely fine, because the reader will quickly have their memory jogged when this character reappears, and they'll go, oh, it's that person, except they didn't wear that hat, and wait, what happened to their arm? Only 3 months have passed. What happened to their arm? It's best not to inundate the reader at the very beginning with information they already know. Those words are better used describing things that are different. Another thing to note is specific to concurrent stories, and that is that you should always keep in mind what happened in the other story and when. You need to make sure that the story that you're telling at the same time doesn't butt in to the story that you've already written, unless, of course, you have already accommodated for that and set things up in the previous story so that you can write this story that you're now doing and have things happen that influence the first one. You may end up with the writing of a concurrent story going back to the first story and making a few minor changes to make it work, and a minor change here or there, as long as it doesn't have a huge impact on the flow of the original story, certainly isn't a bad idea if, by writing the concurrent story, you've realised that these changes actually make sense. Writing other stories in the same setting can do wonders for making you see the original story in a new light and seeing a few things that you do need to change, though don't go overboard with the changes. Don't, with writing a concurrent story, end up making so many alterations to the original that you've basically got a different story that is almost unrecognisable compared to what it was. Again, it's another thing that doing a lot of planning will help you avoid. Setting everything out, and actually a good way to do it would be to have the two timelines of events right in front of you at the same time. You have the original story's timeline of events, and then you have the new story that you're doing, and you can see things unfolding and where events could interact with each other. And that will help you to generally plan things out. When you're doing a prequel or a sequel in general, actually, timelines are good. Timelines are just generally good. But really good when you're planning the follow-on, or the thing that will flow into the original story. You can see how events have unfolded, and how events will unfold, or did unfold in the case of writing a prequel. Speaking of prequels, if you are writing a prequel very similar to a concurrent story, be careful not to go against the story that you're leading up to the point that you end up having to change huge aspects of the original story. Writing the prequel may prompt you to make a couple of changes, much like writing the concurrent story will, but even more than the concurrent story, you don't want to have things drastically altered by writing this new story that leads into it. The prequel is the thing that is most mutable in this situation. There will be things that were said in the original story that force certain things in the prequel to be. That is just the part of world building and setting up the scene and characters interacting with each other. And those events will be immutable, but everything else around those events you can change and alter. And as long as it works with the flow of the story and doesn't make any huge plot holes for the original story, it's those things that you should change rather than the original. I've talked a lot about sequels, prequels, and concurrent stories here, but I haven't spoken a lot about a what-if story. What-if stories work quite a bit differently to the others. What-if stories have events flowing exactly the same as they did in the original story, up until one point, where something changes, and from that point, you are writing a completely different story. Most of the time in a what-if story, you don't put the things that haven't changed into the narrative, with the exception of maybe a tiny bit right before the what-if event. You presume that the reader has already read that story and is there for the what-if, so you can quite comfortably start at the a few minutes, maybe an hour, however long you need, before the event that changes. And once that event changes, you then need to think very long and hard about what impact that has. You need to look at the original timeline, compare it to the timeline that you're making, and see just how far off that new story veers. And will it likely veer completely off. Do not be surprised if the villain of this story, as it were, is completely different. If the heroes completely end up missing the original quest that they go on. They don't end up going to recover the sacred artifact, or they don't try and stop the cataclysmic vortex. They end up going for something completely different, because the events that they're now experiencing lead them in that direction. Keep in mind the stuff that they've missed, of course, because them not dealing with that has ramifications. Perhaps another hero rises up in the background to go and deal with that, or perhaps nobody rises up to deal with that, and that storyline takes the course that the heroes in the original story were trying to avoid. But that story, most likely, isn't what you need to focus on. You need to focus on what your characters are doing in the what if. You need to focus on what their new goal is. Perhaps now they're looking for the sacred cheese blade, or they're looking for the crystals that they previously decided that they shouldn't go and get because there'd be no point. Maybe now something has changed which gives them an opportunity to get these crystals, which will mean that they don't have to go and directly face the horrible entity at the end of the story that they had to fight at the end of the first story. If they can get all the crystals, then they can seal it away for another 10,000 years, and they'd much rather do that. Of all of them, what if stories need the most planning of them all, because you are changing so many things with just one event altering. Characters will not be encountered, other characters will be encountered. Some events won't occur, which means that characters that were previously met may be very different. The events that shaped their personality haven't happened. Sometimes a villainous character that nobody liked is a much more likable character. Sometimes a character that was very friendly and approachable is actually really nasty. All of these little changes, they all add up and make a what-if story a really interesting thing to write. They are exceptionally difficult to write, but they are really interesting to dip your toes into, and I encourage you to give one a try at some point. You'll be surprised what you discover about your characters that you may end up taking into the main storyline. Little things that are still true in the original storyline that you only discover through the events that occur in a what-if scenario. And if anything, what-if scenarios can be huge fun to write, as it gives you free rein to go and write things that you never have the opportunity to write in the main storyline. Sometimes they're just absurd, sometimes they're very dark in tone, sometimes, in a story that's typically dark in tone, you get to write a what-if that is full of victory and success, and the heroes doing fantastically well, and it being such a lighter read. The freedom that you have in a what-if story comes with that extra challenge, and while I think it's worth it, it is very tricky. Put a lot of work into it. Put a lot of work into any of these things. If there's one thing, and one thing only, that you take away from this video, it is that you need to put a lot of planning into writing a follow-up. Be it a sequel, a prequel, concurrent story, what if, whatever it is, you need to plan a lot, as much as you did for the first story, if not more. Because you now have things that have happened that you need to plan around. If it is a sequel, you need to keep the previous events in mind as you're going forward. If it's a prequel, you need to make sure that what you're writing doesn't alter the flow of the original story. If it's a concurrent story, you need to make sure that that story doesn't butt into the original and change its trajectory. And if it's a what-if story, I wish you luck. Hopefully, these few little hints will help you in setting the course for your follow-up, or deciding ultimately that you don't actually have room to write a follow-up, leaving you to focus on writing a different story with different characters in a different setting. And when we come back, folks, who knows what topic will be the subject of discussion? Save that there will be a topic, because are there so many more things to talk about when it comes to writing than I initially realised. I thought when I started this that I'd only have 1 or 2 or maybe 3 topics, and yet here we are with this one, and likely many more to come. I just hope that all of these things help you out, even if it's a tiny bit, to write your own stories. And I'll catch you next time, folks, and I'll see you then. Later.